Hello everybody, this is TipTop MTG here today with another Magic the Gathering video. In today's video, I am continuing my series of building a custom Magic the Gathering set from the ground up, including every aspect, including story, cards, packaging, everything. I want it to feel just like a normal Magic the Gathering product, but of course that is no easy feat, and so this is a long-running project. In the past video, I talked a little bit about what my mechanics for the set were going to be, or at least some ideas I had for those. And so in today's video, we're going to be kind of continuing on that trend and talking about themes. However, once we have the mechanics and stuff, it kind of lends itself to some themes. Obviously, we had themes in mind when we built said mechanics, but what we're going to spend a lot of this video doing is talking about your guys' feedback, because this really is a community-driven project. I could go and I could design a set, but I don't think that's really fun. What I think makes this fun is that I'm doing this in parts. The fact that I'm posting this video and then you guys can leave comments or go on my Discord and tell me something and be like, oh, I think this is a good idea. And then you guys become part of the set and, you get to see kind of what happens with it. And it kind of becomes this group effort. And so that's what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend this first little bit talking about some comments, suggestions, some detailed analysis of my last video. We're going to talk about all of it. So the first thing we're going to talk about is my Discord. So a user on my Discord, who I am very, very, very thankful for, did a very, very detailed analysis of everything that I talked about in the last one in terms of mechanics, in terms of literally breaking down every single version of connection. And I gave like 30 of them, and giving, their thoughts on them, what would work, what wouldn't work. And so I just want to say thank you to them. They are working on a really, really awesome project. It's a custom Magic the Gathering kind of format where it's standard and it's filled completely with custom Magic cards and one base set that is like normal Magic cards. And it's essentially a standard format where you can play and there's a meta, and it has, instead of bans, it has fixes. And so it's a really interesting thing. So if you want to check that out, there will be a link in the description down below. But yeah, this is really, really awesome. I'm not going to read all of this just because it would be its entire video. However, I'm going to go through more of it. We have more up here. And so, yeah, this is just really, really amazing. If you want to read through them, this is everything they talked about. So, yeah, you can pause the video. However, what we are going to do is I'm going to pick out like 3 major things that were kind of talked about, and I'm going to read them. So overall, I think of the options you presented, the best one from a design standpoint is connection. When this permanent enters the battlefield, put a connection counter on target land you control. Lands you control with connection counters have all abilities of this permanent. So yeah, that is kind of their suggestion. Of all the connection ones I put, that's what they believe should be the best one. And I do think that was one of my favorite ones going into it. I purposely left some in there that I didn't think would work well, just to see what you guys thought. Maybe I was misanalyzing them. And this was one of the ones that I thought had a pretty good shot at being able to be interesting, but not overly, powerful or broken. It allowed it to do some interesting designs, but not be limited to 6 and 7 cost cards, compared to some where it'd be like, oh, all abilities of this permanent your lands have. That really means that you have to put those in those high rarity, high mana cost slots. And I just didn't think that would lead to interesting design. And so I think, again, this was probably one that I was leaning towards. And then in terms of domination, the other, mechanic that we talked about in detail, they say, overall, I think the options you presented, the most interesting one to design with will be domination effect domination effect for each 1 life target opponent has lost this turn. So it could say domination, scry 1 for each, or scry X, where X is, each life that an opponent lost, or more specifically, like when this enters the battlefield, maybe you return something from your graveyard to the battlefield where its mana value is equal to or less than the amount of damage an opponent has taken this turn. And so it's very similar to like Rakdos style of effects. And we talked about the lore of that in the previous video, so I'm not going to get too much into it. But one of the biggest things that I didn't even think about that they recommended, and I'm going to read this even though it's not on your screen, is essentially, I'm not reading it word for word, but essentially they think, and actually it's really an idea, I don't know why I didn't think about it, this should be an ally colored faction and tribal set. Like, I was already kind of going tribal based with the humans, minotaurs, elves, and witches, and it just makes sense to throw in that fifth one. I was lumping dryads and elves together, but it could make sense to separate them, and then you get these 5 2-color combinations that can each have their own mechanics and be, unique, and then also be able to come together to do something kind of interesting. So I think that that is really, really awesome, and I don't know why I didn't think about it. So I want to know what you guys think in the comments down below. Of course, we are going to expand on this a little bit more after I talk about some other comments. I just want to know what you guys think. I want to, again, thank you for all of your support and like all of these awesome breakdowns. Either way, let's talk about some other comments. I actually got a bunch on the last video, so let's break these down one at a time. So I like the connection type with enchant a land you control to give the abilities. Again, I think this one's one of the ones that's a little bit more balanced. It means that you can only put it on one singular land, and it is not something that you have to worry about. Oh, what if they enchant this creature and give it another ability, and then it gives it to the land? So it's something that seems a lot more balanced. But I also think it is very wordy, and I think that is one problem of it, is that, you do need to figure out the fact that it is both a creature and an enchantment, which on its own can be very complicated, and then you add the fact that it's doing something with lands, and you do run into a couple of issues, but I think nothing that couldn't be, resolved. And so I do think this is definitely one of the connections that is very possible to to see happen. I think one of the other ones is the one where you introduce a new land type, but I do think that also has problems with it. So I would say, being able to limit it is very important for the power of the cards, because again, if you build a mechanic that is inherently broken, you can only put it on expensive cards, and I want to be able to put this on a lot of different cards that do interesting effects. So yeah, I definitely think this one is a completely valid one. All right, next we have, I don't really like giving your lands the ability because it makes you want to not use them for mana, but I think giving a creature's ability is a great idea, especially non-mana ones. And I think, yeah, that's pretty interesting. I did want to make it work both ways because it is connection. However, when you really think about it, from the lore perspective, it makes a little bit more sense of giving your lands the abilities, because your lands, I guess they are helping the creatures. That is just how land works by living on it. But it's an active effort from a lot of these creatures to go help the land. So I think it makes a little more sense to give it that way, but I think you could justify it either direction. I would argue, and obviously, by the way, I'm not trying to argue against your opinion. I think it's great that everyone has a different opinion. I completely understand. There are things in Magic I dislike that a lot of people do like. And so I want to make sure that I include even the opinions I don't necessarily agree with. I understand this completely. I personally, my favorite part of Magic is that choice. Lands that have abilities, you have the option of, oh, do I cast this spell or do I activate this ability? And it kind of gives you this dynamic where maybe you didn't lose the game because you drew the wrong card, you lost the game because you made the wrong choice. And that makes Magic much more of a skill-based game than something, if everything is just play whatever you draw, that's not necessarily as interesting. But I also understand, like, if all of your lands have abilities, it can feel and put you into an awkward play pattern. So it can feel bad and put you to an awkward play pattern. And so I do think it does need to be balanced, where these abilities are not things that essentially just lock down a land. Like, I think I have to be very careful with abilities that don't have a mana cost to activate, for instance. Like, I don't think the castles from Throne of Eldraine are awful. I mean, they're like really good cards, but because they have such a high mana cost, you never think, oh, I'm only going to do this on my turn. None of them have that good of an ability, but they have a good enough ability where it's worth sometimes having a land enter the battlefield tapped. And so I think it's going to really depend on how cards are designed of how they work. But again, I think giving your lands abilities or giving your creatures abilities is fine. But then again, that does require a massive amount of non-basics. So that is something to consider. Next, let's talk about this. So this is a idea for a card, or not a card, what am I saying? And a mechanic. Influence, sack this creature, pay 3 life, discard a card. I assume, I don't know if it's all 3. I think that could really be variable. You might be able to do different costs. Gain control of target creature an opponent controls until end of turn. Untap it, it gains haste. Only creatures with the creature type leader would have this ability, and you can't really put it on a 1 or 2 drop because of balance. So maybe only above 3 CMC. All right, so I think the idea is really, really interesting. The fact that there are leaders, I actually think that part of it is probably my favorite part. I mean, influence is definitely an interesting idea for a mechanic, but I do think it is, you know, very, very powerful. If you do need to sack a creature, pay 3 life, and discard a card, that's a little bit more balanced. The one issue I would say is if it's a repeatable effect, like that's just something you can always do. You could pay 3 life, discard a card, kind of gain control of a creature, swing it at someone, sacrifice their creature to another influence ability. So I think, you know, you'd really need to adjust that a little bit. But I think this effect works better, in my opinion, as like a 1 or 2 off instead of a whole mechanic. Because generally, when you do a mechanic, you need to be able to, like, if you're building a mechanic and you can't build a deck around it, that's fine, but it's generally not going to do as well or be as interesting, in my opinion. I think that maybe it'd be cool to see a cycle of creatures all with like this ability, but a different way to trigger it. And maybe that's something to do with, you know, the leaders. And I do think it could be pretty interesting to have the leaders as a creature type. Maybe we could find one that already exists in Magic, like Advisor or something, or Noble, and be able to use those. But I definitely think giving the leaders, and you know, they're going to be legendary and all that, but maybe giving them certain sort of creature type is interesting and something that we can really look at. Maybe we don't even do a creature type. Maybe we add a little bit of a legendary matters theme, and you can just kind of have the legendaries be the leaders or the people in power. And I think that could be a really interesting thing where we see like, hey, there are cards that care about the people who are in power, and there are cards that care about the people who aren't, which is of course the difference between a legendary and a non-legendary creature. So I think it's interesting. I don't know if there would be enough cards that would want this to make it a mechanic, but it could be like a repeated thing you see. For instance, in Strixhaven, we had the ability on, I believe, 3 cards to pay a blue or a red and then a blue or a red to discard the card and create a treasure token. Technically, that could have been an ability, but didn't appear on enough cards to make it worth that, and it would have been a little awkward in the middle of the set. But it can be, like, it's repeated text. You can find it on multiple cards at multiple rarities. So I could definitely see having this be a thing. So I really like it. Another one from the same person, maybe called Connection Home Turf instead. All right, so this is something I want to talk about. Connection is probably going to be a placeholder unless I really can't come up with something else. It could be, you know, plane bound, spark bound, home turf, any of that. And I may do a poll about it. Like on a video or whatever, or if you guys have any other ideas for what to call connection, leave those down below. I will be like keeping a list of what everyone says, so I'll add home turf to that list. But yeah, I definitely think that is one that could use a little bit of a change to the name. All right, then we have for connection, maybe put a connection counter on a land, then lands with connection counters have all abilities of creatures you control. All right, so this one is one of those ones where I think we're starting to venture into the territory of really, really busted, or at least the potential to be, because it's very hard when designing to account for all creatures. Like, you know, obviously when you're looking at designing any card, it's probably going to go infinite with something in Magic's past. However, if you know, if you have any way of untapping, like for instance, there are cards with untap abilities, you know, you do have to worry about those generating infinite mana, and then you have to really, really consider how it might affect the rules. For instance, if you have a creature that has an ability that only works for something a creature has, for instance, increasing power, toughness, all of that, giving it a creature type that a land couldn't have, all of that, you do have to be worried about what that does for the rules. And so it's easier to kind of control what abilities it has. And I think a perfect example of this is Ikoria with Mutate. There was not a single card that let you mutate cards together that didn't have Mutate. You know, you could mutate onto another creature, but you were always going to be like the effects added were always going to be of the mutate creature, which then meant they could control what those effects were, versus this would be really open. It would be like, oh, I cast an instant and now this land that's not from my set has the abilities of this creature that's not from my set, and therefore has an issue where it could be very busted very quickly. So I think that is the main problem with it, meaning that putting a counter would have to be very difficult because it would be a very big combo enabler. And then if you're making it so difficult to put these counters on lands, then you run into an issue where it's like, oh, I might as well not be playing the mechanic. So I think it could be interesting maybe to have an individual land that does something like this, where it gains like if it has a connection counter on it, it gains abilities of all creatures you control. Maybe that could be an interesting land idea, but I think making it the whole mechanic would be very restrictive creatively, and so I think I might steer away from this a little. But I love your opinion. I don't want to discourage anyone from leaving their opinion. I appreciate everything. All right. Um, Next, let's talk about the creature type. So on the left, we have what was kind of recommended, and on the right, I did make one little change. So I like humans, witches, minotaurs, elves, but I didn't think elves and dryads were different enough. I feel like it could get kind of confusing in the art, and it just didn't feel amazing. So I changed it to survivor, which interestingly, if we look, there's only ever been one of it, and it's a token created by a not survivor. So, interesting in that it is technically a creature type in the game. It doesn't have any support whatsoever, and I think it makes a lot of sense. This whole story is built around surviving. And I do want to, since we're moving into a 5-color faction set, kind of move witches away from the infiltrating every single group necessarily. I think I want to make them 5 unique tribes that all have interesting abilities. And I think survivors have some interesting potential. Of course, you could argue the humans are survivors because they're just trying to survive. But I think these survivors are going to be kind of a mix where they're like living off the land still, and just trying to survive. They're not trying to survive like the land exploding. They're trying to just survive all the chaos that's being caused by the other 4. And I think that could be kind of an interesting perspective on it. But again, if you guys think that this is kind of dumb or it interferes too much with what the humans are trying to do, let me know in the comments down below. All right. Next, let's talk about like themes and mechanics. So here's what we have so far. We have innovation for humans, which we haven't talked about in this video. It's either innovation or ingenuity or improvise or energy, one of those style of effects, which is we don't really have anything for at the moment. Dominate, dealing with the amount of damage dealt, connection having to do with lands, but we don't have anything for survivors and witches. So we're maybe won't have mechanics for them, but I think it'd be kind of cool to have a mechanic for each. Either way, let's talk about what themes, because that's really what this video is about. Let's convert those mechanics into themes. So humans care about artifacts, minotaurs care about dealing damage, and elves care about lands. But what are witches and survivors going to care about? Well, survivors could care about +1/+1 counters. They're living off the land, slowly getting stronger by surviving. But I think what I would really want to do is staying alive. For instance, if we could either design a mechanic or design such a way that every turn the creature stays alive, it gets bigger. And that could be in the form of +1/+1 counters, or maybe not bigger, but it gets better. So, for instance, maybe there's a mechanic that just says at the beginning of each upkeep or at the beginning of your upkeep, put a survival counter on it. And then you can do various things with those counters. So I think getting your creatures to stick around could be pretty interesting. You have green for the protection side of things and red for the creature side of like survival and all that. So I think it's a perfect color combination for that. Also, they both do, or green does +1/+1 counters and red does temporary boost. So you do have that like boosty feeling to them. So I definitely like it. Let's talk about witches. We could do one about permanents leaving the battlefield. And this is the one that I am the least sure about. But I think, being in blue-black, it's definitely going to be the control-y one. I mean, if you look, generally there's a control-y color combination, like a more aggro color combination. Obviously, the Minotaurs here are playing that role of an aggro style of effect. The witches here are playing the control style of effect. Elves and humans are a little more mid-rangey, trying to generate value. But I could argue that like elves and humans are both also just like almost tribal, a little bit heavier. And then survivor is definitely mid-range, trying to just kind of just survive, like get your creatures down on the board, generate value, win. That's what survivors are trying to do. And I think that's really, really interesting. However, what I want to look at is the combinations because, one of my favorite parts about the Ravnican guilds is that a lot of the time if you combine them, you get some really interesting things. For instance, if you combine Dimir and Golgari, you get this interesting control graveyard combo. And I just wanted to see kind of what these themes combined would do. So we have artifacts and leaving the battlefield. Okay, so a controlling artifact deck. That doesn't seem crazy. Humans and minotaurs, artifacts and damage, kind of a Bernie artifact deck, or maybe just using artifacts to generate value and then deal damage using that value. Artifacts and staying alive, I think that one works really well. Artifacts and lands, though, that feels a little awkward. Leaving the battlefield and dealing damage feels like a pretty, red control deck. Witches and Survivors, leaving the battlefield and staying alive, I think is the most contradictory one here. If you're trying to just stay alive, you're probably not worried about controlling your opponents. So I just, that one's not my favorite. And of course, not all of these need to make sense, but I just wanted to see, like, were we going to end up with a bunch of things that don't make sense if you draft a color combination? Some of these, by the way, are like 4 color combinations, and some of them are 3 color combinations. So keep that in mind. Which is leaving the battlefield and lands, getting lots of mana, then being controlly doesn't seem overly crazy, although it is blue, black, white, green, so, yikes. Minotaur plus Survivors, damage and staying alive. You're slowly chipping away at your opponent, staying alive. Minotaurs and Elves, dealing damage and lands. Getting a bunch of lands, ramping into a big damage spell and winning. Seems pretty fair. And then staying alive plus lands. Staying alive to generate a bunch of lands. I think that one makes a lot of sense here, and that one actually is a 3-color combination. So yeah, that is actually going to do it for this video. It was a pretty long one, but I wanted to spend a lot of time talking about what you guys have to say, because I think that is the most interesting part of this project. If you guys have any, concerns, questions, comments, ideas, anything, leave them in the comments down below, or join my Discord at the link down below. You can also check out the custom Magic format Discord in the comments down below as well. If you enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe to stay up to date with everything Magic the Gathering, and see more of these videos, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.